happening in our country today, I can only say we need more Fred Russells. Fred, rest in peace. God bless you.
The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past 3 weeks, we've seen several disturbing images of members of the media facing repeated forms of abuse. They've been subject to slanderous slogans hung from vehicles, forms of physical and verbal intimidation, and constant heckles and jeers from protesters and occupiers. While reporting on the blockade in Surrey, BC, at the border crossing, a camera crew was swarmed with protesters who had to be escorted out of the area by police. In Edmonton, a media outlet felt it necessary to remove the company branding from one of their vehicles out of fear of safety of its employees. Media crews right here in Ottawa, the capital of our nation, had to hire security in order to cover events right out front of this building. Mr. Speaker, this is unacceptable. In a democratic and free society, the role of the media and freedom of press to be able to report without intimidation is essential. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize and thank all journalists, camera crews, and members of the media who have covered the front lines of this event for the past few days. The importance of your work can often go unrecognized, but it is essential to our society, and we thank you.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the members of the Bloc Québécois, I would like to recognize the absolutely extraordinary work of the employees of Parliament over the past few days as this House sat in extraordinary circumstances. While the police forces in the streets were bringing the siege on the Hill to an end, women and men here were working tirelessly to allow us to debate the confirmation of the Emergencies Act. From the cafeteria staff to maintenance to the sergeant-at-arms team to the entire clerk's team to the security guards, everyone was here despite the turmoil of the last few days, and that is simply admirable, Mr. Speaker. I want to especially highlight the tremendous work of the interpreters as we debated 16 hours a day this weekend. Again, absolutely admirable. I wish you some quiet and some rest. Congratulations and thank you all again. The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, I am honoured to rise in the House today virtually to recognize the achievements of our athletes from our region. Did you know that 1/3 of the cross-country ski team at the Olympic Games came from the Outaouais? Congratulations, Catherine Stewart-Jones, Antoine Cyr, and Laura Leclerc, for your excellent performances at the Winter Olympics 2022. You've inspired us during this very difficult time. We needed that. You are role models in determination, resilience, and perseverance. You will surely inspire young athletes in our region. So Catherine, Antoine, and Laura, congratulations once again. All of the Outaouais is proud of you.
The Honourable Member for Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, February 22nd is Canada's National Human Trafficking Awareness Day, thanks to the hard work of the All-Party Parliamentary Group to End Human Trafficking and Modern-Day Slavery. Human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery that turns people into objects to be used and exploited. It's profitable, vicious, and it's growing, and it's happening right here in our own country and around the globe. In Canada, the vast majority of human trafficking victims are women and girls born right here, and many of them are Indigenous. Globally, more than 40 million people are currently enslaved. To the victims and survivors of human trafficking, you are not invisible. We see you. And we will steadfastly continue the fight against human trafficking, both in Canada and around the world. To my honourable colleagues and all Canadians, on February 22nd, take a moment to 1. Learn about human trafficking. 2. Raise awareness in your communities. 3. Support survivor-led organizations. Get involved and create the change. Together, we can end human trafficking. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow is Human Trafficking Awareness Day, as my colleague has just said. Human trafficking is a form of modern slavery that turns people into objects to be used and exploited. In Canada, human trafficking takes on many forms, including sex trafficking, forced labor, forced marriages, organ trafficking, and cyber sex trafficking. 93% of the victims are Canadian. 97% women and children, 50% Indigenous. Slavery is used in many of the products Canada imports. Human trafficking is vicious, it's profitable, and it's growing. It's time to end human trafficking. There are 4 things you can do on February 22nd and every day thereafter. 1, learn about it. 2, tell others. 3, support anti-trafficking organizations. And 4, get involved politically. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Brampton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. James William Roman escaped slavery in Maryland and came to Canada via the Underground Railroad. His grandson, Dr. Charles Lightfoot Roman, was born on May 19, 1889 in Port Elgin, Ontario. Dr. Roman was one of the first Black Canadians to graduate from McGill University's Faculty of Medicine. He was also one of the first Black Canadians to enlist for service in First World War. Moreover, he was a surgeon, author, researcher, lecturer, and a recognized expert in industrial medicine. To this day, Dr. Roman's grandson fondly recalls how his grandparents impacted the lives of Canadians in times prior to universal healthcare. They were a heroic team of doctor and nurse whose back door was never closed to those in need because their kitchen served double duty as a public clinic. Let us always be thankful for the many contributions of Black Canadians to our great country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Huron-Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are more divided than ever before. But one topic all Canadians can agree on is the cost of living. Every visit to the grocery store, every time you fill up your vehicle, or you get your home heating bill, Canadians are reminded of the Prime Minister's inflationary monetary policy. Inflation was 4.8% in December, 5.1% in January, and many economists say the true cost of inflation is over 10%. Housing costs have doubled, rent is unaffordable, and in some cases, used cars are now worth more than new cars. Who would ever thought? Seniors, working families, rural Canadians, urban Canadians are all stretched to the max. Mr. Speaker, it's time for the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister to get their heads out of the Davos clouds and start listening to Canadians. Well done. Thank you.
The honourable member for Glengarry Prescott Russell.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow Canadians across the country will raise their forks in honour of the great women and men who grow and deliver the very best food on the planet. La Journée de l'Agriculture.
Canada's Agriculture Day is an opportunity for all of us to thank Canadian farmers and food processors who work tirelessly to put high-quality food products on our kitchen table every day.
Canada's hard-working farmers and food processors are the backbone of our economy, especially in our rural communities, and we are grateful for their dedication and hard work. So tomorrow, let's celebrate Canada's Agricultural Day. Célébrons la Journée de l'Agriculture du Québec.
Let's celebrate Canada's Agriculture Day.
Our food processors mean so much to us, to our families, to our communities, and to our country. Let's raise a fork to the food we love and to the people who produce it. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Haldimand-Norfolk.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to represent the riding of Haldimand-Norfolk, which has been a refuge for so many seeking freedom from before the early days of Confederation. In 1793, the Act to Limit Slavery declared that any enslaved person who reached Upper Canada, which the abolitionists called the Promised Land, became free upon arrival. Right down the street from my home was one of the last stops to the Underground Railroad, the village of Canfield in Haldimand, where the remains of a community of former runaway slaves was recently discovered. Since then, Black Canadians have fought in wars for Canada, have made many contributions in politics, arts, sport, business, academia, medicine, law, and many other areas. These contributions tell us that Black history is not separate from, but an integral part to Canadian history. This month, we celebrate Black history and freedom. Thank you, Haldimand-Norfolk, for preserving this Canadian legacy of freedom. Let freedom reign.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in any situation where police intervention is required, whether to maintain or restore public order, our peace officers must demonstrate a strong sense of individual and collective responsibility. They must remain calm in the face of invective and also show empathy. The coordination of the intervention is the key to success, and I would like to congratulate the police officers of the Service de Police de la Ville de Québec, supported by officers of the Sûreté de Québec, who are able to protect citizens' right to demonstrate while preserving public order in the center of the national capital of Quebec. During 2 weekends, their work allowed citizens to be heard while respecting the lives of citizens living in downtown. In the same vein, I would also like to acknowledge the work of the thousands of police officers from across Canada who managed to regain control of the streets here in Ottawa without excessive force and with respect for the citizens who wanted to be heard. The balance between freedom of speech is founded on democracy. Let's not take it for granted. The Honourable Member for Alfred Pellan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada is closing the 2022 Olympic Winter Games in 4th position as the most decorated country with a total of 26 medals.
Team Canada's athletes presented extraordinary performances, making our country shine internationally. What an amazing team. Nous pouvons être particulièrement...
We can be particularly proud of our Quebec athletes who excelled and brought home 13 medals. In snowboard, Max Parot and Elliott Grondin. In freestyle, Michael Kingsbury, Manon Thénault, Mia Fontaine, and Louis Irving. In speed skating, Valérie Maltais, Kim Boutin, Steven Dubois, Charles Hamelin, Pascal Dion, and Jordan Pierre-Gilles. In women's field hockey, Marie-Philippe Poulain, Anne-Renée Desbiens, and Mélodie Daou. A big congratulations to Team Canada.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Today this House will hold a historic vote. Years from now, many in this room will reflect on this debate, the crisis that led us here, and the profound historical impact it will have. At times, debate has been heated on both sides, and I feel the rhetoric has served no one. But we cannot understate the reasons we are here. The hate, intolerance, threats, destruction, and intimidation have left a lasting scar on our national psyche. Canadians have been left shocked and traumatized. Today's vote will happen. Tomorrow, the wounds will remain. We all have an obligation to fix our political system that is failing Canadians. We must fight for proportional representation so Canadians feel that their votes count. We must truly address climate change so parents can see we care about their children's futures. We must provide the supports for gig workers so they can have a livable wage. We must build affordable housing and secure it as a human right. We love this country, so let's fix it and leave it in a better state for future generations. We owe Canadians that much.
The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 25 days after the arrival of the first trucks of the occupant convoy, the streets of Ottawa are finally free. This is thanks to the exceptionally well-coordinated work of 7 police forces, including the Sûreté du Québec. On behalf of the Bloc Québécois, I would like to thank all officers who participated in ending the siege of Ottawa and Parliament Hill. Their professionalism and patience were impressive. Just 3 days ago, it seemed almost impossible to imagine a peaceful resolution to this occupation. Yet this is what literally materialized before our eyes as we watched the operation from our office windows. In closing, I would like to specifically acknowledge the impeccable work of the Parliamentary Protective Service, which allowed members of Parliament to continue to work safely in the name of democracy despite what could have been dangerous circumstances. Thank you to all of you for your professionalism and for your service.
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, in 1970, Tommy Douglas took a stand against government overreach when he courageously opposed the use of the War Measures Act by Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And yet, where is that courageous and historical NDP today? They're standing up for the son of Pierre Trudeau, giving him extraordinary powers to freeze bank accounts of political dissidents without due process, Mr. Speaker. But when the Liberals fired unvaccinated minorities in the public service, the NDP did not stand up for them. When the Liberals enacted policies at the border that cost blue-collar workers their jobs, the NDP did not stand up for them. When those marginalized and traumatized by government mandates and restrictions mobilized into the largest pan-Canadian demonstration ever seen, the NDP did not stand up for them. I call on my NDP colleagues today to use this rare and extraordinary power they possess in determining the vote on the Emergencies Act tonight to stand against giving Liberals unprecedented power. I call on them to stand up for workers. I call on them to stand up for democratic rights. I call on them to stand up for everyday Canadians and vote no, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Winnipeg South Centre.
Mr. Speaker, EC.
Here in the province of Manitoba, February 21st is Louis Riel Day.
Each year, we reaffirm Louis Riel for what he was, a passionate leader advocating justice for the Métis people. He inspired the birth of Manitoba. Distressed by what he saw, the loss of Métis traditional lands, Riel called for action. À l'âge de 25.
At the age of 25, Riel formed a provisional government and presented Canada with a Bill of Rights.
On May 12, 1870, the bill became the Manitoba Act. 151 years later, on July 6, 2021, I was witness to the Government of Canada and the Manitoba Métis Federation signing the Manitoba Métis Self-Government Recognition and Implementation Agreement, an historic step in the renewal of the nation-to-nation principle and recognition of the Manitoba Métis Federation as an Indigenous government. Let's reflect, let's celebrate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions, question orale. The honourable leader of the official opposition.
Conservatives, along with others, don't believe the Emergency Act was necessary to clear the protests and blockades. Many experts, including people like Chris Lewis, former commissioner of the OPP, are saying the government had all the tools they needed and the Emergencies Act was an overreach. The Prime Minister reported this morning that Ottawa is clear, the trucks are gone and the borders are open, but he says an emergency remains. Can the Prime Minister tell us what is the criteria for this emergency to be declared over, and on what date will he end these unprecedented and invasive measures?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Emergencies Act is enabling critical measures to end these illegal blockades and prevent further occupations. We've heard from police chiefs, security experts, and municipal and provincial leadership that it has been essential to the response. We've been very clear that these measures will apply only when and where necessary, and again, these tools are to supplement local capacity, not negate or override it. As soon as these measures are no longer required, we will gladly lift them. This is responsible leadership.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
Can the Prime Minister tell us exactly what powers the Emergency Act is giving him today that do not already exist? I know he said he needed the Act to force tow trucks to tow trucks away, but as he's already said, the trucks are gone, so we don't need tow trucks any longer. What power is needed right now, today, under the Emergency Act that doesn't already exist under current Canadian law?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
After weeks of people being harassed in their neighborhoods and seeing small businesses forced to close, after billions of dollars were stalled in trade, putting people's livelihoods at risk, after evidence of increased ideologically motivated violent extremism activity across the country, and after a flood of misinformation and disinformation washed over Canada, including from foreign sources, it became clear that local and provincial authorities needed more tools to restore order and keep people safe. I ask all members of Parliament to stand up for Canada this evening.
The Honourable Leader of the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talked earlier today about mending fences. He called on Canadians to call their unvaccinated cousin and for Canadians to aim for more decency in our public discourse. I would like to ask the Prime Minister if he would be willing to lead by example and apologize to Canadians that he called racist and misogynist and with unacceptable views because he disagreed with them. I think it would go a long way, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister rise today and would he lead the way?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the right of Canadians to express their opinions, the right of Canadians to protest peacefully, to disagree with their governments is something we will always stand up to protect and withhold, even to uphold, even with the implementation of the Emergencies Act. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms continues to apply. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, continuing to demonstrate the way Canadians are being there for each other, not harming their neighbours, not occupying cities, but being there for frontline workers, being there to support each other. That has been the story of this blockade and this pandemic.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the member for Beaches confirmed this morning in this House that I'm not convinced that the Emergencies Act should be implemented after today. I will vote for it, but now because it's a confidence vote. Is it true that you've called for a confidence vote? Will you start an election with this if they don't vote for it? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Emergencies Act allows us to take essential measures to end the illegal blockades and to prevent the occupation from starting again. Security experts, police forces and officials have told us that this act is essential. They've clearly said that these measures will only be applied as necessary. These are tools that are in addition to local capacity, and we will cancel these measures as soon as necessary. Thank you. The Honourable Member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Many words, Mr. Speaker. I've listened to the Prime Minister carefully, but it's not enough to tell Canadians to talk to each other. The Prime Minister himself has to set the example. When he listened to Canadians who do not think like him, did he take time to call the member for Louis Hébert in terms of voting for these emergency measures? Will he call each of the citizens that he insulted over the past weeks? It's time for the Prime Minister to walk the talk. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Since the beginning of this pandemic, this government, like almost all Canadians, have been there for each other. We supported each other during difficult times. We were there for small companies and for seniors and for our frontline workers. And this will be the history of our pandemic. It won't be the history of people who are blocking streets and preventing people, other Canadians, from doing their jobs and for living in peace. It'll be the history of people who are there for each other. And it is these people that we will continue to work with for the future. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than 2 weeks ago, the City of Ottawa asked for 1,800 RCMP officers so they could adequately resolve this crisis. Last week, they showed that this was actually the correct solution. But even more than 2 weeks ago, I hope the Prime Minister considered the Emergencies Act. But since he didn't invoke it every time there was a protest, I hope he will resist that temptation. But can he now renounce to the use of the Emergencies Act? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we are still in a precarious situation across the country. We're happy to have seen the work that our police forces did over the past weekend here in Ottawa and Gatineau to ensure everyone's safety in the National Capital Region. We've also seen interventions across the country to prevent other convoys from going to places where there are blockades that could be formed. We're going to remain vigilant, but of course, we're all looking forward to noting the end of these emergency measures, and we will be evaluating the situation every day. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. I would ask the Prime Minister to identify at least one place in Canada or Quebec that justifies the existence of this act right now. He talked about tow trucks and financing and freezing bank accounts, not for 2 weeks. Well, let's make legislation for 2 weeks, not permanently, if there is criminal actions done with criminal funding. But he wants this to be a confidence vote because he's fearing his own caucus. Can he not admit that these are not the right means to go about this? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I would like to note that I appreciate enormously the commitment of the Bloc leader in terms of emergency additional measures that we could debate in this Parliament once the emergency state is over, to ensure that our police forces and authorities do have all the necessary tools so that they can deal with illegal occupation or criminal acts such as this one. For the time being, we're still in an emergency situation. And I know, like all Canadians, that we're looking forward to end these emergency measures as soon as necessary, and we will continue to monitor the situation closely. Thank you.
Member for Burnaby South.
The occupation in Ottawa and the blockades on bridges and borders across Canada has had a severe impact on workers. We know workers in Windsor, auto sector workers, workers in the downtown core of Ottawa, like the Rideau Centre and others, were severely impacted. They lost days, in some cases weeks, of wages that made it even harder for them to put food on the table. The government's announced a plan to support small businesses, but not a plan for workers. Where is the plan to support the workers that have been impacted by the occupation and the blockades?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Leader of the NDP for his support of workers, and I agree with him on that. We have continued every step of the way through the difficult past 2 years. We've had to be there for small businesses, for seniors, for young people, for workers, and we will continue to do that. We recognize that on top of the pandemic context, these occupations and blockades have been extremely difficult on businesses and workers, and we're moving forward with measures to support them. This is something I think we can all agree on in this House, to be there for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
The occupation in Ottawa and the border shutdowns have hit workers very hard. It is increasingly difficult for them to make ends meet. The Liberal government announced a plan for small businesses that are affected by the occupation and the blockades, but nothing for workers. Where is the plan to help workers impacted by the occupation in Ottawa and the blockades across the country? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Leader of the NDP for his commitment to workers, and we share his concerns. And that is why, for the past 2 years, we've implemented historical measures to support workers, small businesses, seniors, and families struggling because of this pandemic. And that is why we're committed to being there for people who need our help because of the occupation of Ottawa. Yes, we put forward a program for small businesses, and we're going to continue to take care of workers as well.
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal member for Beaches East York said today in the House, quote, I'm not convinced the emergency measures should extend beyond today, he said. I would vote accordingly, but it's now a confidence vote. It would seem that the Prime Minister is strong-arming his backbench and the NDP to vote in his favour by threatening an election, Mr. Speaker. Isn't that true?
You're right on the Parliamentary Secretary. We'll go with that.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker. I think that we all breathe a sigh of relief at the phenomenal work that was done by law enforcement to bring order and peace outside of these doors. I look forward to the vote that's going to be taking place in just a few hours to have this House affirm the powers that were needed to ensure that peace and stability, and to make sure on a preventative basis that we do not see a return to that level of disorder.
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, the blockades have ended. Downtown Ottawa has been cleared. If there was ever a national emergency, which remains in doubt, it's over. So there is no need for the Emergencies Act vote tonight, but it would seem then that this vote tonight is about far more than the blockades and the protesters in downtown Ottawa. It would seem it's only about power. Yes. About the government having the power and setting the precedent that bank accounts of political dissidents can be frozen. Isn't that right, Mr. Speaker?
That's right.
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to just highlight how instrumental the Emergencies Act has been in allowing us to address very effectively, but in a manner that is consistent with the Charter, the illegal blockades. And I, too, want to take a moment to express my profound gratitude, and I hope all members in the chamber will say thank you to the RCMP and all members of the law enforcement who, in a very professional, measured and restrained manner, have restored order to the streets of Ottawa and have ensured that we've made progress at our borders. Mr. Speaker, we will only use the powers of the Emergencies Act as long as necessary.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, over the past week, we've heard that Canada didn't need emergency measures to resolve the issue in Ottawa. Thousands of police across Canada were able to solve the situation. This isn't the first time this has happened. However, continuing to impose the Emergencies Act, which doesn't have its place in my opinion, is not necessary. The Ambassador Bridge was cleared without this act. Why is the Prime Minister insisting on invoking an Emergency Act that Canadians don't want? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Over the past days, we've seen now blockades have been lifted at our borders and in the downtown Ottawa area. I'd like to thank all of the law enforcement officers for their professionalism. The Emergencies Act was key, but we'd like to end it as quickly as possible. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, in my hometown of Quebec City, demonstrations took place without the emergency legislation. What was lacking clearly in Ottawa in recent weeks was leadership. The Premier of Quebec does not want the Emergencies Act, and neither do 7 other premiers, but they are imposing this extreme act. Why does the government insist on keeping these measures, even though the premiers don't want it? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to reassure my colleague and all members of this House that all of the measures in the Emergencies Act were used in consultation with all the authorities in provinces and municipalities. We're going to continue to work together with the provinces and territories with advice from police forces as long as this act is necessary, but we will withdraw it as quickly as possible.
For Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, has the government received a legal opinion from either the Attorney General or the Department of Justice whether the emergency powers granted under the Emergencies Act, particularly the power to freeze financial accounts, are consistent with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? And if so, will the government release the legal opinion to the House before this evening's vote?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. I am confident as Attorney General, Mr. Speaker, that we have met the standard to apply the Emergencies Act. And as we have stated on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, we are required as a government that any measures that we take will conform with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including Section 8 rights of search and seizure.
The Honourable Member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Justice Minister or the Finance Minister. First, how many bank accounts have been frozen under authority of the emergency proclamation? Second, will the government commit that no further funds will be frozen without a court order verifying that a rational connection exists between the funds and the unlawful blockades? And third, will any currently frozen accounts for which a rational connection has not been demonstrated be released forthwith?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Well, I want to thank my colleague for the many questions, but I will say at the very beginning that the RCMP have clarified that at no time they provided any list of donors to banks for enforcement under the Emergencies Act, Mr. Speaker. And with regards to those financial controls which are being exercised under the Act, Mr. Speaker, as we've said many times, those powers are being exercised in a manner that is consistent with the Charter, including due process rights, as well as the right to be protected against any unreasonable search and seizure. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Avignon, La Métis, Matane, Matapédia. Mr. Speaker, the occupation of Ottawa is over. There are no trucks left in the streets. The protesters have left. The police are in control of the situation and normal life is resuming. And yet tonight the House will vote on the implementation of the Emergencies Act to address what the government wrongly calls a national crisis. Not only has there never been a national crisis, but there's no longer a crisis at all. Will the Prime Minister immediately rescind his declaration of a state of crisis? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we have seen progress against illegal blockades, but threats still exist. The Emergencies Act will be key in terms of ending illegal blockades. We received advice from experts and police officials that have said this act is still necessary. The Honourable Member for Avignon, La Métis, Matane. Mr. Speaker, this is completely absurd. The Prime Minister wants us to vote for extraordinary measures to get no trucks and no protesters off the streets in Ottawa. And yet if we oppose it, he'll make it a no-confidence vote, so he can call a second unnecessary election in 6 months. But worse than that, what he is demanding means that for the first time in history, the House of Commons would support the use of Emergencies Act to deal with a problem that no longer exists. Does the Prime Minister realize how low a bar he is setting and how damaging a precedent he is setting? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, with all due respect for my colleague, despite the progress that has been made, there are still risks. Risks in Ottawa, in front of the House of Commons, at our borders. There are a lot of efforts to keep illegal blockades from resuming, and that is why, in the opinion of police forces, we will continue to keep the Emergencies Act for now, and will use these measures with great responsibility, with all the respect due to the Charter. The Honourable Member for Avignon, La Métis, Matane. Mr. Speaker, still absurd. Dozens of trucks who have left Ottawa have threatened that as soon as they can, they will return. So how long will the Prime Minister keep these emergency measures in place? Will he leave them in place forever, even if there's no crisis, just in case the trucks come back? Seriously, Mr. Speaker, what is it going to take for the government to realize that the Emergencies Act did not solve this crisis? It was a well-concerted police intervention like we've been asking for since the beginning. The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, legislation is working. All of the measures that are in the Act are temporary and targeted, and they're going to be used in respect of the Charter. And they'll be removed as quickly as possible. At the same time, we have to listen to the advice of our police forces.
Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Speaker, the Finance Minister said at a press conference this morning, and I quote, "For anyone who is concerned that their accounts may have been frozen because of their participation in the illegal blockade or occupation, the way to get your account unfrozen is to stop being part of the blockades and occupation." Well, the blockades have ended, but concerns over frozen accounts has not. Speaker, what mechanisms are in place today to help those who are accidentally caught in the government dragnet?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to be very, very clear, the RCMP issued a statement today that clearly and unequivocally stated that they have not released the names of donors to the banks and that they are doing their job of targeting those individuals who are primarily responsible for that, including the people who have parked their trucks illegally on the streets. Mr. Speaker, for any individual, any Canadian who happens to have their accounts frozen by their bank, they should call their bank and find out why.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier. Mr. Speaker, the Emergencies Act allows for bank accounts to be frozen. Many Canadians have told us that their they don't know the rules or how long they will last. We must not trivialize this law. It is very worrisome. And even worse, the Minister of Finance wants to introduce legislation to give more power to the banks without a mandate. Can the Minister commit to establishing mechanisms for abusive decisions to help innocent Canadian citizens? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to remind the member, first of all, there is nothing retroactive in the measures we brought forward. They take effect on February 15th. So anyone who, for example, made a donation to a cause prior to that wouldn't in any way be impacted by these measures. Additionally, there is built right into the Emergency Act parliamentary scrutiny and subject to scrutiny by this House, Mr. Speaker, and by the other place. And so the concerns the member that brings forward can be addressed quite appropriately within the existing Act.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, a financial crime expert says the Emergencies Act is a, quote, serious deviation from normal democratic process. A U of T finance professor says banks may be inclined to overreact so as to not run afoul of government. Security and finance experts say there are no suspicious activities or credible threats with protest-related donations. There's no evidence, court order, or due process, and no limits on what direct or indirect participation means. It's already happening to my constituents. So when will frozen bank accounts be up and running again?
The Honourable Minister for Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the Integrated Command Team, which is composed of the Ottawa Police Service, the OPP, and the RCMP, have been clear and unequivocal. The authorities that have been provided to them under the Emergency Act have been essential to the progress that they have made in getting the situation under control. And, Mr. Speaker, we've also heard from the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, that's all the chiefs, the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police, and even the Canadian Police Association representing the rank and file, all have been clear and unequivocal. These measures were essential and have been helping them restore order in this country.
The Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Mr. Speaker, while some MPs are claiming that the threats are now over, Canadians are still living with the impacts of the ongoing convoy crisis. In BC, the Pacific Highway crossing had to be preemptively closed this weekend, blocking commuters, essential workers, and goods. The RCMP arrested 16 people, while other unlawful activity could not be addressed on the spot due to lack of resources. After weeks of failed leadership from the government, will the minister assure Canadians that they are now acting with the urgency needed?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Well, I want to thank my colleague for highlighting one of the ongoing risks that we face, which is a threat to our borders, our trade corridors, which are so critically important to keeping Canadians at work and our economy rolling, Mr. Speaker. That's why we continue to listen very carefully to the advice that we're getting from our police services, who say that the Emergencies Act is instrumental in having addressed the blockades at ports of entry and continues to be instrumental in preventing them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, what happened in Coutts, Alberta is unprecedented. Conservatives are downplaying the severity of what is happening and are pretending that the threat is over. There was a plot to murder RCMP officers by dangerous extremists. Millions of dollars are still coming in from foreign sources to fund these hate groups.
Order, order. I've got the volume as far up as I can, so I'm not hearing the question. So we keep a relative roar when we're asking the question. The member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, what happened in Coutts, Alberta is unprecedented. And Conservatives in this House are downplaying the severity of what is happening and are pretending that the threat is over. There was a plot to murder RCMP officers by dangerous extremists. Millions of dollars are still coming in from foreign sources to fund these hate groups. When will the government bring forward legislation to halt all—
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do share the concerns of my honourable colleague around the severity of the charges that were laid in Coots, including conspiracy to commit murder. Of course, Mr. Speaker, honourable colleagues will recognize that it would be inappropriate for us to comment on ongoing matters which are now before the courts, but I also share her concern around the rhetoric and extremism which we have seen not only in Alberta but right across the country, which has motivated some of the individuals. Mr. Speaker, we need to be vigilant about that. We need to be sure that we deal with those threats, Mr. Speaker. That's one of the reasons why the Emergencies Act is there to help protect the health and safety of Canadians. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Speaker, the last 3 weeks have been extraordinarily difficult for the people of Ottawa. Major roads blocked, noise at all hours of the night, people threatened and intimidated in their own communities. Despite the severe economic impacts of the last 2 years, downtown businesses were forced to shut their doors yet again. This past weekend, we saw police execute a coordinated plan that finally removed demonstrators and their vehicles from Ottawa streets. This only came after the federal government invoked the Emergencies Act for the very first time in our nation's history. Can the Minister of Emergency Preparedness explain to this House why the Act was needed to bring the situation to an end? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I wanted to thank my colleague for a very important question. The actions of the illegal blockaders at our critical infrastructure, essential trade corridors, and even here in the streets of our nation's capital was causing great and lasting harm to our country, to our economy, and to our citizens. Mr. Speaker, this was clearly and unequivocally an emergency that required extraordinary measures to restore the rule of law, to protect public safety, and to protect Canadian interests and infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, I want to lend my voice with my government in a word of thanks to our law enforcement officials who did the job we needed them to do and have protected our interests.
The honourable member for Regina Louvain.
Mr. Speaker, we're at a point of time in Canadian history I never thought we'd reach. Canadians in the nation's capital are seeing fences put up around the street. Police check stops at every intersection, and some Canadians are mistakenly having their bank accounts frozen. Tonight in this chamber, every single member of Parliament will have to rise and say if they agree this is the Canada they want for their kids and grandchildren. My question to the Prime Minister, how did he convince the federal NDP to sell out the core beliefs of Jack Layton and Tommy Douglas?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the member that all of the powers which are being used under the Emergencies Act are being done in a manner that is very proportional, measured and respectful of the Charter, including protections around due process and the right to be protected from unreasonable search and seizure. Mr. Speaker, we're always reassessing the need for the Emergencies Act. We're listening very carefully to the advice that we're receiving from law enforcement, and I want to assure him and all members of this chamber that we will absolutely retreat from the Emergencies Act as soon as we can. Thank you.
The honourable member for Regina Louvain.
The minister doesn't get it. Canadians just don't trust him and his government. We have an historic vote this evening. Liberals have desperately tried to justify the Prime Minister's power grab and overreach. We see the leader of the NDP bending over backwards to prop up the most corrupt government in Canadian history. To the Prime Minister, on top of the cost of...
Let me just... the word of corrupt is something that we maybe can rephrase that a little bit. The honourable member for Regina Louvain.
We've seen an NDP leader back up a scandalous government we've seen throughout the history of our country. To the Prime Minister, on top of the cost of our freedom in his new Liberal emergency state, when will we see the celebration of the Liberals' official coalition with the NDP with the swearing in of a minister? Perhaps next time.
The honourable minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we have seen is in another reversal, a party which once tried to characterize itself as a party of law and order have now abandoned all pretext of supporting law and order in this country. Mr. Speaker, when we've heard unequivocally from the Canadian chiefs of police, from the Ontario chiefs of police, from the police rank and file, from the police commanders who are restoring peace and order to our city, who said these measures were necessary and appropriate. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, we're used to the flip-flops, but this one's extraordinary.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, the trucks outside are gone. The protests are over. There are no more blockades. Yet this Prime Minister is still determined to punish those involved under the Emergencies Act, where there is no due process to protect the innocent. Worse yet, Mr. Speaker, he does this with the NDP's support. When did this Prime Minister lose all respect for the Charter, and when did the NDP lose their way?
That's right. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, as my honourable colleague has now heard on several occasions, the tools that we are using under the Emergencies Act are very practical, very targeted, and very measured. We're talking about designating secure zones. We're talking about choking off illegal funds which could be used to aid and abet the illegal blockades. We're talking about rapidly deploying the RCMP so that we can restore public safety, Mr. Speaker, here in Ottawa. All of these things the Canadian Association of the Chiefs of Police have supported. The Ontario Association of the Chiefs of Police have supported. The Canadian Association Police, who are the rank and file of police frontline responders day in and day out, support the Emergencies Act. When will the party of law and order actually support the opinions of the law and order?
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
This party doesn't support the Charter of Rights, Mr. Speaker. It also doesn't seem to understand the continued use of the Emergencies Act for this Prime Minister's political purposes will only further divide Canadians. Now, former NDP MP Sven Robinson said that it's a very dangerous precedent is being set. Why has the Prime Minister not rescinded these emergencies powers today?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the short answer is because we are listening to law enforcement who have given us a very considered view that threats remain to our communities here in Ottawa, to the neighborhoods here in Ottawa, Mr. Speaker, who have for far too long been under siege, Mr. Speaker. We're listening to law enforcement about the threats that remain at our borders, where trade corridors and supply chains are vital to the Canadian economy, to keep Canadians at work, Mr. Speaker. That's why we continue to use the Emergencies Act, but we're doing it in a responsible, measured way, consistent with the Charter, and we will sunset the Emergencies Act as soon as we can.
The honourable member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, there are increased tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and armed conflict is imminent. We must face facts. Even if no Russian forces have crossed into Ukrainian territory, the country is already under attack. For weeks now, the Canadian government has claimed that it will participate in imposing severe sanctions on Russia if it invades Ukraine. But, Mr. Speaker, the offensive has already begun. Ukraine needs the support of its allies now, not when it's too late. Will the government immediately impose preventive sanctions to dissuade Moscow from following through with this attack? The Honourable Minister.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. And as the honourable member knows, we are indeed ready to impose severe economic sanctions should Russia further invade Ukraine, an invasion that has been going on for many years. We're working closely with allies, the US, the UK, and the EU. Sanctions are always most effective when they're done in lockstep with other countries. That's exactly what we do as we stand with the Ukrainian people and with Ukraine.
The honourable member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine has asked its allies for immediate sanctions. Now, Moscow has already officially announced that it will recognize the independence of the Donbas territories, which is the first step towards their annexation. Ukraine has already suffered through a cyber attack, a maritime blockade, military pressure, and a disinformation campaign designed to justify an invasion. Just last week, the Foreign Affairs Minister declared that sanctions will come into effect on the first day of an attack. Well, Mr. Speaker, the attack is underway. Will Canada fire a shot across the bow and immediately impose sanctions against Moscow?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada firmly supports the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We strongly condemn Russia's decision to recognize the Donetsk and other regions in Ukraine. This is a violation of the Minsk Agreement and against the Charter of the United Nations, and it represents a threat to stability in the region. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are not fools, and even the Prime Minister's caucus is growing increasingly nervous with his imprudent governance. He says that he has had no choice but to invoke the Emergencies Act, and now he's made it a confidence measure for his own caucus. This sets a precedent, and it must not be taken lightly. What's more, the Prime Minister says we need to keep the emergency measures in place as a precaution for 3 months. Is he actually telling us that he's going to invoke the Emergencies Act every time he disagrees with a protest and every time his leadership is under threat? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of the illegal blockades, the government has taken many concrete actions. For example, we provided increased resources to police forces, but at the same time, the Emergencies Act has continued to be necessary to help police services and to prevent illegal blockades that might come back. And we will revoke the measures as soon as we possibly can.
For Halliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Thank you, Speaker. Parliament Hill is now cleared. Most of the charges in Ottawa involve trespassing and mischief. Tow truck operators already were compelled to help authorities before the Emergency Act. Our borders were cleared prior to the never-before-used law being activated. Organizations like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association tell us that the government isn't limiting the act to just Ottawa. It applies universally across the country. It does not target just one specific protest and applies to every single Canadian. So going forward, Speaker, how often does the Prime Minister plan to use the tool of last resort as a tool of first resort?
The Honourable Minister of Emergency Preparedness.
Mr. Speaker, I think even the member opposite would acknowledge that when we see the type of criminality taking place on the streets of Ottawa, when we see the attacks on our critical infrastructure and cutting off vital supply lines into this country, that constitutes an emergency because of the harm committed against our country and our citizens. And Mr. Speaker, we are prepared to do what is required, and we're working very closely with law enforcement, Mr. Speaker, who have the important task of restoring the rule of law to our streets and protecting our citizens and our critical infrastructure. And we will only use those measures as long as they are required.
The Honourable Member for Foothills.
Mr. Speaker, the Emergencies Act is intended to be a last resort to deal with a clear, imminent threat. It's not a sledgehammer to deal with some future unknown crisis. There's no security threat. The streets are empty. The blockades are gone. There's no threat to our democracy. We're here in the House of Commons with the world watching, about to have a critical vote. So if there is no threat, will the Prime Minister end his abuse of the Emergencies Act, or is this just a ploy to ensure that the infringements on Canadians' charter rights and our bank accounts are permanent?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I would hope that the member would have seen over the course of the last number of days that far from using a sledgehammer, the police have been restrained, they've been patient, and they have been professional in carrying out their responsibilities under the Emergencies Act, which they continue to say is necessary to bring about the end of the illegal occupation here in Ottawa and across the country. Mr. Speaker, there are still risks, but I assure every member in this House that we will sunset the Emergencies Act as soon as we can, and in the meantime, the powers exercised under it will be done in a manner consistent with the Charter.
The Honourable Member for Surrey Centre.
Mr. Speaker, for the last 3 weeks, law enforcement partners have been coordinating their efforts to end illegal blockades and disruptions in Ottawa and at border crossings. The RCMP have assisted municipal and provincial forces when requested, helping to stop unlawful protest.
We have an appel au règlement.
A point of order. There's no interpretation.
Trouble with translation. I just want to make sure that the member has his headset selected correctly. I'll give him a second just to make sure it's on his headset and not on the microphones, because it did kind of sound like he was just on his computer instead of the headset. All right, the Honourable Member for Surrey Centre.
Mr. Speaker, for the last 3 weeks, law enforcement partners have been coordinating their efforts to end illegal blockades and disruptions in Ottawa and at border crossings. The RCMP have assisted municipal and provincial forces when requested, helping to stop unlawful protesters and restoring the freedoms and livelihood of all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, why is the continued use of Emergencies Act necessary to ensure Canadian livelihoods and quality of life are protected?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague for his excellent question and for all of his hard work in representing his community. And he will know, Mr. Speaker, why the Emergencies Act continues to be necessary. Because in Surrey at the Pacific Highway, we saw a recent effort to once again obstruct trade corridors, which has a direct and significant impact on the economy and Canadian jobs, Mr. Speaker. And I know that is a central concern for the honourable colleague. I hope it is for all members in this chamber. And I hope that tonight everyone will see fit to support the passage of the Emergencies Act so that we can end the illegal blockades, so that we can get back to life as normal as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I asked a serious question earlier, which the Attorney General did not answer. I asked whether or not the Attorney General or the Department of Justice rendered a legal opinion regarding the public order emergency powers and the Charter. Surely his answer to my question was not the sum total of that legal opinion, if it exists. So I ask again, Mr. Speaker, is there a legal opinion, yes or no? And if yes, will the government release it to the House ahead of this evening's vote?
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. Were he a lawyer, he would understand that I would not answer that question. I speak as Attorney General for the Government of Canada in giving legal opinions. I've assured this House, I've assured the Canadian public that I feel that we have met the legal standards based on the decision, and that
I can stand here all day and just wait for everybody to come to order, and I want to bring the temperature down just a little bit. I know the Minister of Justice was trying to answer the question. I'll give him 10 seconds maybe to finish up. That's about as much time as he has. The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you. And as I was going to finish, Mr. Speaker, the reason why, as an Attorney General, one never discloses whether or not one has an opinion is because that could be construed as giving consent to divulge that opinion, Mr. Speaker. It's covered by solicitor-client privilege, and it will remain so.
That's what we're looking for, is the opinion itself.
The Honourable Member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is an example of a failure of leadership. Legal experts, civil liberties organizations, and many others are sounding the alarm, stating that emergency legislation should not be normalized, that it threatens our democracy and charter liberties. With the support of the NDP, the federal government is ordering financial institutions to freeze the bank accounts of Canadians who don't agree with them. Why are the Liberals and the NDP so willing to trample over the rights of the citizens they represent?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, since the outset, we've been very transparent with Canadians about the reasons why we've invoked the Emergencies Act. There has been a very vigorous debate in this chamber about why, in the government's view, we meet the test under the Emergencies Act, and I assure my honourable colleague that all of the powers which are being exercised in it are being done in a responsible, measured, proportionate manner, in a manner that is consistent with existing provincial and municipal authorities, and we will sunset the Emergencies Act as soon as we can. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, we'll work with law enforcement to restore public order and public safety. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was legislative assistant here in the 1980s. I knew legendary NDP co-founder Stanley Knowles, elected 13 times for Winnipeg North. The 1970 debate invoking the War Measures Act, Mr. Knowles said, we have to work very hard to show that in our kind of society, we still think there's a better way to deal with ideas that we don't agree with. Why did the NDP coalition not listen to these sage words of Mr. Knowles before implementing the act?
The Honourable Minister of Emergency Preparedness.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And although I appreciate the member's New Democratic viewpoints, let me say, Mr. Speaker, the Emergency Act is not the War Measures Act. A progressive conservative government, back when conservatives called themselves progressives, brought in this legislation which was charter compliant, which respected the rights of all citizens and respected every freedom contained within the Charter. Mr. Speaker, it's a carefully crafted law. a law that we have complied with throughout. In articulating our reasons for bringing this forward, Mr. Speaker, I think even Mr. Knowles would recognize what's been happening on our streets and on our borders constitutes an emergency that requires...
The Honourable Minister, a member of Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By invoking the Emergencies Act, this government has ensured that our police forces had the tools they needed to dismantle the illegal blockades and end the occupation. We have heard directly from experts and from police forces how these tools have been used to do exactly that. And could the minister please update this House on how the measures, including the financial measures put in place, continue to play an essential role in ending these illegal blockades and allowing Canadians to get their lives back to normal? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
I'd like to thank my colleague for her excellent question and for all of her hard work in recent days. We have seen progress in Ottawa and elsewhere. There are no more blockades in downtown Ottawa, and our borders are open. I thank the RCMP and our police forces for all their good work. All of the measures in the Emergencies Act have been very practical. They've been targeted, and they're temporary. And all the measures have been implemented with respect for the Charter, and we will sunset the law as soon as we can. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Windsor West.
The Ambassador Bridge blockade caused over $1 billion in economic losses. The bridge is now open, but new barricades are blocking local business, cancellations of doctor and health appointments, and continued job losses. Since the Emergency Act started, further convoys have been turned back and resources have been invested to protect this national route, even when we've just recently faced a bomb threat. The government has offered supports for Ottawa businesses affected by the occupation, and that is good. Will this government ensure that they are helping all the border municipalities and their workers who are harmed by the convoy crisis, because it still carries on?
The Honourable Minister, Public Safety.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for Windsor West for his advocacy and his hard work in representing his constituents. We've maintained very open lines of communication during the illegal blockades, Mr. Speaker. He highlights why it is that the Emergencies Act continues to be necessary given the risks in Windsor, in Coutts, other ports of entry like Surrey, Mr. Speaker. We're going to work very closely with my honourable colleague from Windsor-Tecumseh, the Mayor of Windsor, to ensure that small businesses have all of the supports they need so that we can get the economy going again, notwithstanding the challenges of the illegal blockades, Mr. Speaker. This government will be there for those impacted by them. Thank you.
Excellent. The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As honourable colleagues will know, from the beginning, I've been very concerned that the regulations appear overly broad and not connected to the declaration itself. I want to ask the Minister of Justice and Attorney General if he's satisfied, and if he can satisfy me, that the declaration is tied to these regulations, that they cannot be used other than for this specific emergency as described in the declaration.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question. The way in which the regulations or orders are based on the declaration, Mr. Speaker, as well as the way in which they're written, clearly indicate that they flow from the declaration. So I can assure the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, and I can assure Canadians that the regulations or orders can only be used for the combating this particular emergency and no other situation, Mr. Speaker.
Well, that does it for question period. Thank you so much for all participating and staying relatively coherent. Yeah. And I'll go to the daily routine. So, tabling of documents. The Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Natural Resources.